Hello and welcome to the November session of the Roundtable Death Café series. The first half of today's event features two panelists who will discuss their work as death educators and share their experience with the Death Café format. For the second half of today's event, our audience will lead their own conversations in small, private breakout rooms, which will follow the traditional Death Café model of participant-led discussion. We are grateful to be joined by two esteemed panelists, Corinne Alstrom-Sonne and Kastner. Corinne is a Black, queer, cisgender woman with disabilities living and working in Toronto on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Massasaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat. She is a trained death doula and hospice volunteer and holds a Bachelor of Social Work from Ryerson University. As a death doula, she provides dying people, their families, and friends with spiritual, social, and emotional support. She works within a social work framework of meeting the client where they are at. Kastner has been bringing the patient voice to healthcare education since 2000, when she pioneered patient education television networks that broadcast in top teaching hospitals across North America. Currently, her focus and passion is improving meaningful communication and shared decision-making in end-of-life conversations. She is in her 6th year as patient advisor on the International Summit of Leadership Education for Physicians and is a patient partner on a PCORI-funded evaluation of advanced care planning in 2 different settings. Before we begin, please be aware that you may input your questions into the chat feature, located on the lower right-hand corner of your screen. We welcome your questions at any time throughout today's event, and at the end, we will turn to your questions for a closing Q&A with our panelists. If you'd like assistance with closed captioning, you may toggle on the box located in the lower left-hand corner of your screen that provides captioning for the spoken words of our event today. We now turn it over to Sarah Kiskaden-Bechtel, Program Director for the Completed Life Initiative, who will be our host for today.
Hello and welcome to all of you in the audience and to Corinne and to Kathy for joining us today. It's an honor to have you in this space with me, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation. So let's begin. So let me turn to Kathy first, and then we'll get this rolling. So how would you define a good death, Kathy?
You know, I define a good death for me as being at peace at the end. And that covers a whole bunch of things from paperwork to informing everyone around me, what I do and don't want to do, and preparing people for when I'm dead. However, that is not everyone's definition of a good death, and I always find it interesting to ask that question because there's so many things people don't consider when they're talking about a good death. So as you can imagine, it's quite individual, but out of all of this, it seems being at peace, whatever that means to the individual person, is how I'm going with it.
Thank you. That's a great start to begin our conversation today. So Corinne, I understand that this term death literacy is an important aspect to the work that you do in educational outreach. So I'm wondering if you can elaborate on the idea of death literacy, what that entails, to ground us to what you mean by it and what you're hoping to, further define within the world around death literacy.
Sure. Death is a hard thing, a difficult thing, a scary thing. I find that the less you know about something, the scarier and more difficult it is. So for example, let's say you're taking your small child to get an MRI or something, and they just see this big machine and they hear the loud noises and the people in the gowns and they don't know what's going to happen or what's going on. Compare that to sitting down with your child and saying, okay, no, this is a big camera and you slide in and you lie and relax and we'll take some pictures of inside you and that will help the doctor understand how to make you better. Still have a sick child, it's still scary, but look how much you can ease that situation just by having some knowledge and uh, some understanding of what's happening. So that at its core is really where what I see death literacy as. It very much reminds me of, growing up in the 90s and early 2000s. There was a lot of hullabaloo in Canada as well as in the United States about sex education for young people. And should they know what a condom is? And should they, all these things that nowadays we kind of look back and a lot of us that are like, whether people choose to be sexually active or not, how much easier would life be if you knew more? Um, and I was a sex educator in my younger years. So I saw firsthand how fear and discomfort can be sort of eased the more you know about something. And I kind of take that same mindset into my death literacy education, down to biological facts of what's happening in the body, down to, living in Ontario, Canada, what are the laws? What can I do? What can I not do? And I find that when I talk with people, a lot of the questions that I get are less so the esoteric questions and more of the concrete questions. Burial versus cremation, or, um, where they want to die, or accessing MAID, which we'll talk about later, or all kinds of concrete things. So that's really where my my work has centered itself.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Can I add to that?
Please.
Um, First of all, I think everything that Corinne has said is exactly right on, and I take it back to before the death, not the biological, us understanding what dying actually entails, looks like, feels like. But even before that, there are many decisions and crises that we people don't know even to ask about, more than whether a procedure is invasive or not, whether it's going to be considered a minor procedure or not, whatever the thing happens to be. My death literacy education extends to saying, ask these questions. Ask how long recovery is going to be. Ask if after the end of recovery you're going to be back to normal. Ask if you're going to be able to get supports in the home for anything that you're going for. Determine that the people around you who often influence our decisions, we generally don't make these kind of decisions in a vacuum, make sure they understand what expectations are as life winds down, so that there isn't a situation like there was with my brother and sister-in-law. Brother was dying. Sister-in-law says, they're not testing him for diabetes anymore, with some outrage. And I think, did no one say to you that if someone is dying, those things may just be more invasive? And what is the outcome? So I think death literacy, in addition to starting these things in school or being part of what we learn, there's no expectation why we should know this until we're in the middle of it. So that's my death literacy dissertation. You've just heard, I expect my PhD next year. Thanks for the opportunity to add.
Thank you, Kathy. While you were talking, it brought to mind this idea of preparation. And often, death doulas are on the other side of the spectrum from birth doulas. And so, when someone prepares to give birth, they have 9 months to prepare, and perhaps more if they've been planning for a while. And yet often death may not be allowed that amount of time. And 9 months is a significant amount of time. So I'm curious what the role of preparation is within the death education work that both of you do.
Sorry, is this question for me or for Kathy?
So let's start with you, Corinne.
Sure. So the question is, what role does preparation play? Uh, Preparation is everything. Um, Sometimes there was something that just flashed in my mind and now it's gone. Welcome to ADD. Okay,
We've all been
so
there. No worries.
yes. Um, so there's preparation on all kinds of fronts. There's your financial preparation that a financial advisor can help you with. There's your legal preparation. There's your, my mom just did her pre-planning where she planned out her cremation and what flowers she wants and all that kind of stuff. Um, there's your spiritual preparation. You might work through that with a member of clergy, or depending on your spiritual orientation, you might work through a lot of that on your own. There's there's just a lot to prepare for. And like you said earlier, Sarah, about starting in schools, or Kathy, I can't remember if it was you who brought that up, but preparing at a young age, you don't wait till a young person is in bed before you start telling them about condoms or anything like that. Why should we wait till we're struggling to breathe before we start to prepare and learn about the end of our life, dying, what that looks like, what that might feel like, how we feel about it, how we might prepare our friends and families and ourselves, what that means for us spiritually, and all of those things.
It strikes me that often, like preparing to go on a vacation or to travel somewhere, you have your checklist of all the things that you
Mm-hmm.
need to be done, and those are the logistics. Clean the house, make sure that, whoever has a key can get in and has the emergency contacts, and just itemizing those housekeeping elements. But the I think what's really important and what you're raising, Corinne, is this idea of spiritual and psychological, emotional preparedness. And that has deep embedded roots within how that person is situated within their family, within their community. So I'm wondering if you can also speak a little bit to that component, and how that often how patients often navigate that, or how you might consult to help someone navigate that.
Kathy, do you want to speak to that piece or?
I think it's nuanced and complicated in that, yes, while birth preparation in a way can be paralleled to death preparation, in a way much like birth, and Sarah, you already know my feelings about it. I do not think it's a fair comparison, which I'll happily elucidate on. But as with birth, there are times when we can hear and times when we do not want to hear. We do not want to hear about the 48, people in birth, they're happy to tell every pregnant person that they meet just exactly how their pregnancy and labor and delivery went. Sarah, you don't have kids yet, do you? Just wait. Just wait. And sometimes these are helpful, and sometimes they represent the other person's needs. And I think that other people's needs need to be managed, especially as relates to the emotional aspects of losing someone and the decisions of whether this is going to be right to keep them alive, even if they've decided they don't want to do it. So I think there is a management aspect of preparation that one has to respect where the preparing person is in their journey, And if they are not ready to be talking about, I don't know, shortness of breath, you know, what happens if you're short of breath? You know, I don't want a breathing machine, but wait a second, if you're short of breath, those kind of conversations require sensitivity and a recognition when someone just isn't ready to talk about it, even though it's important to me, they may not be there yet. And I think that's often what happens. It's so important to us, to the people around the dying person, that they insist upon using their own agenda to move things forward. I don't know, Corinne, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I've definitely seen situations where not so much even the dying person, but like the family, um, there have been a couple of deaths that I've been privy to where the family doesn't use the word death, they're not ready, they've never talked about it. There are a lot of euphemisms that come up. I hear a lot of, they're making her comfortable, and that, like, I'm supposed to automatically connect that to death. Or, you know, there's nothing that can be done, which is not correct. They can help control pain, they can help prepare, they can help control shortness of breath, nausea, pain and symptom management. There's always something that can be done. Even after the death, there are things that can be done. Um, so yeah, I would agree with that, Kathy.
Now I had something to say and it's gone. Perhaps you have it, Corinne. Do you have what I was going to say?
It might be floating around somewhere.
So it's interesting, Kathy. I want to touch upon what you mentioned earlier about um, why you disagree with relating death preparation to birth preparation. And since our audience may or may not have seen your TEDx talk, wondering if you could elaborate on that.
Absolutely. Thank you for the opportunity. And I remembered what I was going to say. It is that on the death literacy front, there are words that we understand completely differently, like Corinne just said. Words like withdraw, even a word like hope can be understood completely differently by every single person in the room. So I think those jargons, those languages should not be dismissed and just assumed that you understand what everyone else is talking about. So my reason for pushback about death preparation being like birth preparation is that with a birth, you have a life ahead of you. You have possibilities, you have joy, you have the growing with a kid and learning about the kid. Death is a loss, it's a finality, it's a sorrow, I mean, yes, you can certainly celebrate that person's life, but I think it does death a disservice to be constantly equated with birth, because I believe it asks people to react differently than we often understandably do react. Anger, grief, all the things that go with death that do not go with birth unless it's a bad birth. Hello, pussycat. So that's why I object to that. But I also think everybody gets through this their own way. If one needs to equate it to a birth experience, then who am I to say, wait a second here, let's do an actual comparison. And I think that's often a hard thing to do, especially in death preparation, to have someone accept being non-judgmental, no matter how hard it is internally to say, like my brother-in-law is a paramedic, and and his father's 102 years old. He still wants to think he's going to have CPR if his heart stops. And my father-in-law is saying, he's got a lovely Scottish accent, is saying, no, I don't want that. I've had a good life. I don't want that to be. And the brother-in-law is saying, listen, I'm a paramedic. I know better than you. And I don't doubt that's not unusual. And my TED talk was really about the the aspect of comfort, which in a way, in my opinion, should be a given at any time during a health procedure. Would we not expect to be kept comfortable for a heart attack, a broken leg, for COPD, whatever? So that the notion of introducing comfort care can be a bit off-putting and say, but weren't you helping me with that up until now anyhow? Why are you bringing up comfort now when what I want to talk about is survival? What I want to talk about is extending my life, which may not be comfortable. So that's my rant about comfort. And the other portion of TED Talk, though, is to let people in on what you want. Don't just leave it, please, to a piece of paper, an electronic document, something in your family physician's file on you. Make sure everyone around you understands where you're coming from, and that will give you, as it were, a fighting chance to get it, what you want accomplished.
Absolutely. And I think, drawing out this distinction is critically important. As you mentioned, birth is not the same as death, and yet, and I hear your struggle with that analogy. And I think, it's also the limitation of our ability to linguistically refer to this huge life transition. And, the word doula is used in both situations, so it gets a little muddled there. And so, with regard to, the end of life experience, I absolutely uphold your point about comfort care as essential, and really taking care of that person and shepherding them through this experience, because, death is inevitable, death and taxes, right? So how do we step forward to provide that kind of comfort shepherding for each and every person? And it's inherently going to be different. But to the point of, within the umbrella of the completed life, and towards, if a person says, I've lived a good life, I have lived a completed life, and I would like to empower myself towards self-determination. This is often a controversial topic, and yet we embrace it here at the Completed Life Initiative. And so, as death coaches and educators, how ought we to continue these conversations and to work towards improving these conversations so that people can feel the most supported within their families and communities? So perhaps Kathy, we'll start with you and then over to Corinne.
I think it starts with finding out what the person is worried about, scared of, has regrets about. We all know or many people know that there are 2 studies done to say what the most common things the dying person talks about, and regrets is one of them. To tease that out. Sometimes the worry is nothing that the people around you thought it would be. How is my dog going to be taken care of? Etc. So to be finding out those barriers to having a completed life is, in my opinion and experience, the first step for people even being able to articulate. So I think often it's not that easy to actually say what is fearful to you, except for the health writer who said to me, the notion that I'm not going to be there is just too much for the existential part of my brain. I can't talk about this. And what's the answer to that one? But there are many practical things and philosophical things that if you can articulate it, maybe that can be helped to make death easier, less of a struggle.
Thank you, Kathy. And what are your thoughts, Corinne?
On self-determination,
Yes.
I think a lot of what we've already discussed in terms of knowing what the facts are, knowing what your questions are, knowing that those questions can be asked, um, like that's kind of the first step because you can't really get to self-determination without knowing, well, what do I not know? Where are those gaps? How can I fill them? And then comes, well, what do I want? What do I not want? And then comes the self-determination of making sure you can have what you want and not have what you don't want. So for me, it really does go back to literacy all over again. You need to have that to begin with, and then that empowers you to say, okay, well, I want this. I don't want that. And then, what you need to do from there on to make sure that happens for you.
Absolutely. Thank you. So I'm curious, because this is the Roundtable Death Cafe. So let's talk about the Death Cafe model. And I'm really curious to hear from your firsthand experience what role Death Cafes and other perhaps similar events play in your work. Um, what's the experience been like for you, Corinne?
So I haven't hosted death cafes for a little while since I got ill, but in the years prior to that, I've hosted a number of death cafes. Um, there are certain things that always kind of pop out. One is how much people want to talk about death, or at least the people who attend death cafes want to talk about death. And as soon as the conversation starts, it's like everyone just kind of rushes forward. It's like this subject that's been sort of locked up, it feels like, inside of everyone. And then as soon as you say, okay, this is a space where we can talk about this, it's like whoosh, everyone just starts, they have so much to say because who knows when's the last time they've been able to talk about these things or ask questions or talk about, their spiritual beliefs or their physical questions or this podcast they heard or this YouTube video they saw. Um, there's a lot of, in our culture, keeping things to oneself in terms of death. And every death cafe I've been to, whether it's been one that I hosted or just attended, that is stuff that just comes out right away to the point where uh, some people have asked me because they have audio processing issues, like autism or things like that. And they're like, how can we have a death cafe where it's not everyone just talking all the time? Because people are so excited to talk about these events that people have contacted me like, I actually sometimes have a little bit of trouble hearing everything because the volume is just so great. So that tells me that these are subjects that people want to talk about but aren't sure how or where. And the Death Cafe model is one example of how death can be talked about. I hope I didn't miss any parts of your question.
Oh no, that was great. Thank you.
Okay.
Um, and Kathy, I'm curious to hear about your experience.
I attend deaf cafes so that I can identify common themes and write about them. And there are. The Death Cafe-esque things that I've done have included videotaping a group of diverse people. There was 3 different Catholics, and they are all quite different: Mexican Catholic, Canadian Catholic, and I can't remember what the third one was, Muslim, Buddhist, a Protestant, and an atheist. And my question to them to start off with, so it was not quite the Death Cafe format, participant-led, I ask, why is it so scary to talk about death? And one of the answers, and people's answers always are so enlightening and insightful, and I think can often help other people, which is why I end up blogging about it. So one woman said, because you don't know what emotions are going to spill forward. You don't know what kind of Pandora's box you're going to open, and are you going to be spiritually, physically, whatever, prepared to deal with an onslaught that you hadn't expected. And so this is even aside from the differing opinions of how one should go and shouldn't go. But because it is such an emotional, fraught topic, and then people absolutely want to do the same thing they do with birth, tell you their terrible death stories. And one of the things I have found a bit frustrating may not be the word to use, but unsolvable are system-related problems. So the number of people who will talk about a palliative care experience, which is really supposed to be the most person-centered specialty of all, and yet it is neither accessible consistently nor practiced to a consistent standard. So when I hear people say, the palliative, they were just terrible. You know, I didn't get this, I didn't get that. And I think, what can I do about that? Nothing. Should I be saying, but you know, palliative care should be or for home care, you know, they came and they took so long getting into the vein for my mother's thing that it hurt her. Well, these are things that can't be solved, that maybe still have to be heard, right? That it is validating to hear that and just acknowledge, validate that stuff. So you know, I favor deep conversations versus small talk. So the death cafes are like food for thought for me. And I think if more people paid attention to what's going on inside them as relates to that, it might be an easier time, which is why I did my whiteboards. But I know we're going to come to that.
Thank you, Kathy and Corinne. Just a quick announcement for the audience listening in. Our roundtable discussion will conclude at the top of the hour at 1 p.m. Eastern, and then at that point we'll break out into breakout rooms for your respective private Death Cafe conversations. So this conversation with our esteemed panelists, Corinne and Kathy, will continue for about 25 more minutes, and then we'll shift over to the private breakout rooms. So with that being said, excuse me, what I'm curious, you know, the Death Cafe format is something that we've incorporated here on our webinar space at the Completed Life Initiative via the Roundtable event since earlier in the summer. And I'm curious, are there any kind of variations on the Death Cafe format? And if so, are that you've experienced? And if so, do these alterations to the traditional model in your perspective, do they perhaps change or improve upon it?
I, along with Home Hospice Association in Toronto, held the first LGBTQ specific Death Cafe. That was eye-opening. In the sense, and I find that anytime you take a they're gonna have a different sort of flavor, I guess you could say, to the experience, versus an open to all Death Cafe. So with the LGBTQ Death Cafes I've been a part of, I've found a lot more irreverence, a lot more laughter. Not that Death Cafes don't usually have a lot of laughter, because a lot of them do, but and I find that people have a lot more specific legal questions. For example, the trans people who ask me, how do I legally make sure that my family can't put my dead name on my tombstone? How do I, like, a lot of these are questions that are rooted in sort of oppression and fear of oppression continuing through the dying process and after death. Um, and those always kind of break my heart because it's like there's so much to deal with even in life, and then to have to worry about, can I have my correct name on my tombstone? Can I be buried in the clothing of the gender that I am instead of the gender that someone's decided that I am? Can I, if I choose not to be married to my partner, will they be involved in my dying and in my after death stuff? These are questions that can really shake you up. And, if anyone here is a death care worker, I'm sure you've got stories and things that you've seen that are scary. Then I also held with a friend of mine, Carmen. We had an event called BIPOC Death Talk, which is something like a death cafe. And it is for, Black, Indigenous, and people of color to get together and talk about dying and death. And I'm sure any one ethnic group would have specific themes that would keep coming out, but when you sort of bring us together, there are things that come out in those conversations that don't necessarily come out in conversations with everyone. So I've really I've really found it enriching. And since then there have been a few death cafes that I haven't been part of, like spoony death cafes for chronically ill people. Some people have had death cafes for kids. Some people have had pet lovers death cafes. Like, once you start looking at the different groups of people and how they may be affected by death and what kind of questions or conversations they may want to have, there's just so many uh there are so many that just pop up. Um, so yeah.
Such important themes. Thank you, Corinne. Um, Kathy, I know we're running a little bit short on time, but if you have a few comments or thoughts, feel free to jump in.
Thank you. I'm going to do the whiteboard. I decided at a certain point that the unknowns about dying and death were too much for me. And I thought I would concentrate for my own self on what brings me joy, comfort, happiness, small things, small feasible things. And once I sort of stumbled onto the what can be done, I thought I want to find out what other people want to have in their life until they die. Not what they don't want to have, and this has nothing to do with medicine, but it has opened the conversation to people recognizing that their comforts, if you'll forgive that expression since we just talked about that, their small comforts, pleasures, they don't have to relinquish that. Whatever decisions comes up that they may struggle with or that their family may struggle with, if their family knows that, like me, everyone knows my neck gets cold, get this woman a scarf. I mean, the tequila thing, yes, everyone's definitely going to bring me tequila when I die. But it turns the conversation from what I don't want to have to what I do want to have. Make sure all of you, and this came out of one of the videotape conversations where one of the women, a Buddhist woman, said, once I realized my mother-in-law needed her Bible, her Bhagavad Gita, once I realized she needed that, and I put it on her chest, and she calmed down. I thought, that tiny little thing, if someone had paid attention to that, so much upset might have been avoided. So that's what I encourage people to do. Pay attention to what brings you happiness during the day.
I really like your framing from sort of this negative connotation towards a positive connotation of talking about what they would like as a positive expression versus what is lacking. And Corinne, thank you for raising such important considerations with the BIPOC communities because it's not discussed nearly enough in the end of life sphere, and we should bring it to the forefront. Now I want to turn to include our conversation to address medical aid in dying. In Canada, where both Kathy and Corinne are from, medical aid in dying was legalized by a court case, Carter v. Canada, and that allowed physicians to step forward and start providing aid in dying to patients. But that also opened up, how do physicians start to support patients requesting medical aid in dying? And so there's been a lot of work with Dr. Stephanie Green and Dr. Sandy Bookman, among other leading physicians up in Canada, around how do we create a standard of care surrounding medical aid in dying. So with that being said, Kathy, can you explain how you address medical aid in dying and other forms of voluntarily hastening death in the context of a death cafe?
I direct them to dying with dignity because there are so many misconceptions about who can get medical aid in dying here, and each province has a different process. So that when I hear, as I often do, whether it's in a death cafe or just generally, that it's murder on demand and slippery slope and what kind of a society, etc. I say, I am not the authority on this. I can just tell them that I have signed up to be a witness for the paperwork required to kick off the request. And I did that because I wanted to see who was asking for help in dying. Every single person has been so relieved that they have their own autonomy here. That's the only thing I can really share, because anything other than that, I feel I don't give proper due, and I send them to the source that has how to apply for it. Here are the restrictions. Here's the criteria for the 2 tracks. And, some people will never embrace the fact that if I'm suffering, that my suffering is my own suffering, and that no one else should have a judgment on whether I'm suffering or not. That resonates with people. My suffering is my suffering. Don't you be, I'm not going to tell you how much or little you're suffering. So that's how I deal with it.
Thank you, Kathy. So now let me ask Corinne. So, since the law has passed in Canada around medical aid in dying, have you seen any shifts in the way that Canadians talk about death? Has Canada embraced death positivity, or perhaps not? What do you think?
I would say that I haven't really seen medical assistance in dying talked about that much in death positivity settings. MAID seems to kind of be its own thing, and there are people who are advocates and there are people who don't believe in it, but there's it seems to kind of be its own thing, separate from the entire death literacy, death education sphere. I have had to be educated in medical assistance in dying as a death doula. I do have some information in it. I was definitely told you cannot bring this up to a client, they have to bring it up first. So I found that interesting. Yeah, I don't really have a whole lot of hands-on experience in the medical assistance in dying sphere. Definitely Kathy can talk a lot more about that. I will say, as a person living with disabilities, I have heard concerns coming from the disability community, that are basically that people will be forced into medically assistance in dying. Like Kathy said, that it's murder on demand and slippery slope, that kind of thing. Um, we do live in an ableist society. The sad truth is that a lot of people would like disabled people to just die and go away and that kind of thing. Um, is there strong data saying that people are using MAID to make that happen? I don't believe so. Um, there was a case in Montreal of Archie Royland. This predated MAID being legal, where he basically had his healthcare taken away. So he would like choke on his own saliva often. He would just awful things would happen, and he eventually chose to have his respirator disconnected. Um, so you look at a case like that, and it's like, why? He went on the record saying that if he had had the health care that he felt he needed to live with dignity, he wouldn't have had to have his respirator disconnected. So that's a different way of looking at it. And it's hard for me to state all the nuances in it. If somebody chooses medical assistance in dying, I'm absolutely in favor of that. I do sometimes have concerns that those of us with disabilities, not that we're being pressured to choose MAID, but that are there situations where people feel that they don't have another choice because the healthcare just is not competent for them? And that's not a MAID problem, to be clear. That is a healthcare problem and an ableism problem. So I don't know. That is kind of up in the air for me a little bit.
Absolutely. And your points are critically important and well taken. You know, the lack of substantial helpful healthcare, right, is a significant issue within the United States. And even though, you know, from what I understand, not being a Canadian resident, that while there is socialized healthcare within Canada, it's not a perfect system. So Kathy, would you like to add anything to that?
Yes, to your point, it's not a perfect system. However, I'd still rather have this than what we have in the US. Actually, I think a combination of the systems, the best parts of both systems should come together. I am always worried about the perception that the disabled will be asking or pushed into MAID, in that the criteria is very specific, and the issue for me is a combination of poverty, you know, that has nothing to do with palliative care, MAID. It has to do with being able to live, not even with a disability, just being able to live. So those are huge. That's a huge system issue, and to have that being associated, as it's been done in Canada, with, you know, someone who's doesn't have enough money and is disabled, they're applying for MAID. I think that there's something wrong with society if that's the only recourse for someone who is not able. Be that as it may, just because you're disabled does not mean you're eligible for MAID. There are two tracks. One is for the end of life is foreseeable, whatever that translates to. And the second track is for those suffering irredeemably, irreversibly, according to our own determination. But that takes way longer to get approved, to get into motion. The safeguards are there. I just think it is completely criminal that we have a society that only gives people relief in the possibility of dying. That's just, but that's in my opinion, that's a whole other, that's a different kind of completed life.
Well, and it certainly it is not in the sense that we would intend it, right, to be something that's empowering, because what you're talking about is a situation where someone is inherently disempowered from being fully supported in their healthcare, treatment, lack of social support, etc. So I want to make that distinction clear to everyone so that there's no confusion. But um, Thank you both so much. This has been fascinating conversation. And I appreciate delving into and including medical aid in dying within this context, um, because Canada is so, so much more progressive in terms of their aid in dying support. And I think it's important to keep that in mind when we talk about death cafes in general. In order to prepare everyone here today for the breakout sessions, let's give a little bit of a background on um, how to lead your own death cafe, because in a few moments you'll be um, uh, invited to join a breakout room where you can host your own death cafe and have that private, sacred space. And so, with that being said, to both you, Kathy, and to you, Corinne, in leading their own death cafe, what should our audience know? What are some good questions to get started with? Perhaps what might be avoided? What are your suggestions for leading a death cafe?
You better go first, Corinne.
Expect the unexpected. Don't feel that you have to have all the answers. I don't know is always acceptable. This is more of an explorative space than a Q&A space. Some questions you really just need to talk to a lawyer or a healthcare provider about. But yeah, have fun, ask questions, be sure to listen. Um, everyone, like I said, is always eager to get all this stuff out. Try to also listen as best you can, even if you're very excited to speak. Those would be my basics.
Thank you. And Kathy, what are your thoughts?
Safe space. I know this is probably a given, but no judgment. Be respectful. Know that this is a safe space. That's about it.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you, Corinne. With that being said, the graphic on the screen that you're all hopefully seeing, if you need tech support, certainly open the participants panel and click the Ask for Help button, but only use this for technical issues, please. We want to honor the privacy of each breakout room, and so we will not be jumping in and out in order to honor that safe space. When you join the breakout room, make sure your microphone and camera, if you choose, you're certainly not obligated to turn your camera on, are connected so that you can at least communicate your thoughts and impressions. So to that point, make sure you're unmuted once you join the breakout session. And importantly, in order to make everyone feel welcome, please introduce yourself to each other, share your name, your pronouns, and anything else you would like to share with your group. And finally, at the end of the session, you'll be given a minute countdown to about 5 or so minutes before the breakout session concludes. So with that, and without further ado, unless Kathy or Corinne have any last minute thoughts or suggestions, we will pause the recording and turn to our breakout sessions for your own Death Cafe. Welcome back, everyone. And I hope you had a wonderful Death Cafe breakout experience. So we are drawing to the conclusion of our conversation today, and I want to make sure that a few of you have a chance to share your highlights from the experience if you choose to. So we can take a few minutes right now to, you can raise your hand and take 30 seconds to a minute to share about your experience if you wish. And then we will conclude the event for today. See, Nancy has a hand up. Go ahead, Nancy. But let's make sure that she's unmuted first. There we go. All right.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, our group, we talked about how talking about end-of-life topics is not everybody's favorite cup of tea. Uh, and we've often been in situations where we were discouraged from doing that. We don't talk about death and stuff. So once we got together and we knew we were of like mind, we really enjoyed sharing resources with one another. Websites and books and blogs and all of that. And so I don't know about the other folks, but I got half a page here of stuff that I'm going to be looking at after our meeting today. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much to you as well, Nancy. That's wonderful. All right. Well, I'll invite Kathy and Corinne to share a few concluding words, and then we'll conclude for today. So, Kathy, over to you.
Well, since I love talking about this, I could talk about end of life, dying, death forever. So that it was great to be in a room with like-minded people. I learned a lot from both of the other people in the room. It was just great. And of course, Sarah and Zoe, you do just such a good job of this. It's just so refreshing and encouraging and safe and so much knowledge shared. So thanks very much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Kathy and Corinne.
I agree with Kathy. First of all, thanks for having us here. It's always a privilege to be able to talk about all of these topics, dying, death, self-deliverance, and all of these things. I definitely learned a lot. I was with people from United States and the UK, and we talked about the differences in laws and all that's left to be done in all these places. All of the things that are still so unsure for people who want to access a medically assisted death. And it just helps to solidify for me more and more how much work needs to be done in that area. So yeah, that's the main thing for me.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Corinne. And it's been a delight to get to know both of you a bit more on this space. And thank you so much to everyone in our audience for joining us as well. So with that being said, thank you again for joining today's November Roundtable Death Cafe. After you leave this meeting, WebEx will automatically open a survey in your web browser. You may receive a warning that WebEx is opening to an external site. This is a safe link. Click proceed, and the first part of our brief after event survey will provide essential feedback to improve our events and programming in the future. The second part of the survey gives you space to provide a more detailed response if you have the time to do so. We also invite you to visit our website, www.completedlife.org, to join our mailing list if you're not already signed up, in order to keep up with our upcoming events. You can also view recordings of previous Roundtable Death Cafe events, including the recording of today's event in the future, which will be posted in a few days, as well as other past completed life events such as conference sessions, symposia, panel discussions, and more. And of course, we invite you not to just tune into our video archive, but also to read our Completed Life journal, watch our Poetry Corner series, and listen to our podcast, Voices of the Completed Life. You can also follow us on social media, retweet, repost. Our handle is @CompletedLife, and you can also tag us via #CompletedLife. And once again, we thank our panelists so much for joining us today. And round of applause to Kathy and Corinne for taking time out of their busy schedules to share about their experiences with us. And we want to encourage you to follow their work as well. Corinne's website is deathcoachcorinne.com. Corinne is CORINNE.com. Deathcoachcorinne.com. And Kathy Kastner's website is bestendings.com. And you can also find her TED Talk, Exit Laughing, on YouTube. As well, thank you to Reimagine End of Life for co-hosting this event. And for more events through Reimagine, please visit their website, letsreimagine.org. And that concludes the November Roundtable Death Café. On behalf of the Completed Life Initiative, please take care, be well, and sending you our best wishes. And we look forward to seeing you at our next event.